Welcome everyone, and thank you so much for joining us tonight for our Libertarian Feminist Women's History Month event. We are really excited to have a great panel of guests with us, and we will let them introduce themselves in a second. But first of all, I just want to say I'm Elizabeth Nolan Brown. I am the president of Feminists for Liberty. Feminists for Liberty is a nonprofit group that is devoted to spreading the ideals and values and voices of libertarian feminism. We do a lot of different things, including a monthly panel series with different guests. Kat and I, who Kat will introduce herself in a second, we've just recently launched a new YouTube video series. And someday again, we hold in-person events. We have a video contest coming up, which is very exciting. The deadline is the end of April, and we're looking for people to submit short videos on what it means, what libertarian feminism means in the 2020s. So you can find more information about that on our website, feministsforliberty.com. And I'm going to turn it over to Kat to tell us a little bit more about this panel.
Awesome. Thanks, Liz. So I'm Murti. I'm the executive director of Feminists for Liberty, the other half of this project along with Liz. And thank you for coming to tonight's Feminists for Liberty chat. So usually these are a little bit more conversational in structure, but in honor of Women's History Month, we wanted to do something a little bit different here tonight. So we have 3 speakers, all of whom are incredible wealths of knowledge in their respective areas, and they're going to be talking to us about women's history through a libertarian feminist lens and kind of giving us little insights into the areas in which they work. So we're going to have we're going to have 3 short talks, and then we'll have lots of room for you all to ask questions at the end. You can also tweet throughout using the hashtag F4L chats. We'll be taking questions from Twitter and also from the little chat box at the bottom. But yeah, on that note, I'd like to welcome our first speaker to the stage, Jayme Lemke. Jayme is a senior research fellow at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University and a senior fellow in the F.A. Hayek Program for Advanced Study in Philosophy, Politics, and Economics. Her specialization is public choice economics, constitutional political economy, and the political economy of women's rights. In addition to her work on the evolution of women's economic rights and opportunities in United States history, Jayme has written on public choice and institutional theory as applied to policing, higher education, and other local public services. Her article, Interjurisdictional Competition and the Married Women's Property Acts, was awarded the Gordon Tullock Prize for Best Article, published in Public Choice by a junior scholar. You can follow Jayme on Twitter at Jayme Lemke for updates and resources on the political economy of women's rights. And I think you're going to want to after hearing some of what she has to say today.
Thank you so much for inviting me to speak today, Kat and Elizabeth, and I'm looking forward to the conversation afterwards as well. What I'd like to use my time to talk about is the role that economic rights and opportunities have played in enabling women in the United States to throw off centuries, and I don't think it would be exaggerating to say millennia, of patriarchal restrictions on their freedom of action. My expertise is in United States history, so I'll only go as far back as Britain and the British colonies in the 18th century, where we find women being dealt with under the law as if they were the property of their husbands. So they do have some rights of their own, but incredibly restricted by a set of laws known as coverture. And so what coverture did is it defined married women as being legally indistinguishable from their husbands. So the husband was considered the sole property owner of all a family's assets. He was considered the only individual to take any legal action. And he was also considered to have a legally defendable right to not only his wife's property, but also his wife's body, giving him even the ability to sue anyone who might interfere with his right to physical or emotional intimacy. So it's a pretty comprehensive level of control, and it's a pretty clear division of authority and of status that we see within marriage, within family, which is the most fundamental social unit. So what the second order effect, and there are 3rd and 5th and 10th order effects that I'll try to touch on a little bit. But the second order effect of these coverture restrictions is that married women could not independently own land or any other assets. They could not manage their own money. They could not sue or be sued, which, as you might imagine, made it incredibly difficult to start a business, to go into business with other people, and also to pass property on to future generations. So married women they did not have a legal right in how their property would be passed on. Married women could, however, be physically confined or restrained by their husbands. The law at this time did not actually sanction physical abuse, as is sometimes alleged, but women could be imprisoned. They could be committed to institutions based on their husband's word alone. And this legal confinement was enforced by courts, kind of regardless of how women were treated and what their status was in the relationship. You couldn't get out of it. In order to get a divorce in this period of time, you had to have a level of privilege that would enable you to get a parliamentary action on your specific behalf. And so this was the system that was in general imported into the United States, first the colonies and then the early United States. And this system persisted in Britain until the 1880s. And in the United States, depending on which state you lived in, which part of the country, these laws were changed in some states as early as the 1840s, but in some states they were not modified until the 20th century. So they still persisted and they stuck around for a long time, and they left a residue in the law that lasted much longer. And I'll talk a little bit about some of the specific types of laws that emerged out of this early ban on married women being able to own property. But first, I want to go back to that moment in time of these laws becoming codified in the early United States, which began as a very frontier type place. But as we get into the 1820s, 1830s, more cities are developing. There's easier and more consistent access to formal law. So some of these restrictions on married women's property ownership are really starting to bite, especially considering the fact that more different kinds of opportunities exist and women have access to more wealth and opportunities that would generate wealth. So being denied the pursuit of those means something different than it does if you're living in a society where everybody is effectively subsistence farming. And so industrialization, the process of the first factories being created, the first industrial processes, and the cities that grew up around those, it has this connotation of being very dirty. We think about the overcrowding and disease and dangerous working conditions. And that is true. That's a factual account. But I think an aspect of industrialization that a lot of people might not be aware of is how intimately connected it was to women's advancement and to changes in women's rights. So industrialization, and women did have access to the jobs that were created by these new industries. It gave women earnings to protect. And this ability to earn provides both the motivation to be able to argue and defend for your own rights and the means to be able to do so, both in terms of getting people to be able to listen to you and simply having the leisure time that would have been available only to the 1%, the few extraordinarily wealthy in the past. So one example of this is Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who we are probably all familiar with from her work with Susan B. Anthony in suffrage, but in women's rights, the women's rights movement more generally. She grew up on one of these textile mills where young women were employed in Pennsylvania. Her father owned the mill. And it was in part her experience interacting with the women who worked there that led her to question, why is it exactly that these women should not be free to learn and to make decisions for themselves in the same way that men are. I'm going to give you just a real short list here of other types of laws that emerged out of these restrictions on property ownership. So the first one is an issue we commonly associate with women's rights, but the connection to property might be less obvious, and that's suffrage. So one of the reasons why women can't vote originally is that you had to be a property owner. Adult married women could not own property. So we had this process of universal male suffrage, white male suffrage first. And then it's only after that that we, start to actually move towards true universal suffrage. But that comes out of this denial of economic rights originally. We get restrictions on the kinds of jobs women can do. There are bans on how late they can work at night. And if a job is considered dangerous, they're not allowed to compete with male workers at all. Some of these practices, including the denial of higher education and the inability to accumulate resources, wind up having an effect in the United States well into the 1960s and 70s. So requiring a husband to co-sign on your mortgage, that is an artifact of historically women being denied the ability to accumulate property. The fact that we don't see, in most disciplines, we don't see very many women at the highest levels of the academic professions, especially in the 70s and 80s, that was an artifact of women being denied educational opportunity as well as economic opportunity. I could go on, so maybe we can get to, I don't want to abuse my 10 minutes here, and I want to leave myself a couple minutes to kind of wrap up a big picture. So maybe we can come back to some of the other restrictions in the Q&A if there's some interest. But the big picture takeaway for me of this history is just how many of the restrictions that women have faced well into the 20th and even the 21st century that originated as a denial of economic rights. So I think economic rights are often interpreted or thought of as something that you only really need if you want to get rich. But that's not true. It's something you need if you want freedom to act, if you want the freedom to use your own mind to direct your own actions. So the fact that patriarchal law established control of women by their husbands and fathers meant that these women's livelihoods were controlled, their access to the necessaries of life was controlled, and it denies the most basic level of freedom that most of us would consider to be essential to consider ourselves living in a liberal society rather than an authoritarian society. And so when economic control is established in this way, the power relationships it creates, where some are given the authority to decide what others are capable of and how they will be allowed to act. It happens around the world, although the United States has made incredible progress, and especially in the 19th century was really a forerunner. These restrictions on women's work and education and ability to manage their own property and finances and bodies, these still persist in different variations around the world. And so I think recognizing the centrality of economic freedom and economic opportunity to that is going to be essential to getting rid of this situations where women are considered to be in a second class and the world is deprived of their contributions.
Thanks so much, Jayme. I put in the chat box while you were talking. So Jayme's actually probably one of my favorite economists, which is one of those weird questions that you pretty much just get in libertarian circles, I think. But I love the work that she does for a variety of reasons, including the fact that we often hear these ideas that capitalism or free markets are move against women's liberty, and so much of women's liberty actually came from access to markets and capitalistic ideas. So I'm sure we're going to get more questions about that, but before we do, we've got two more speakers who I think are going to really cause you to question some of the things that you often hear around women's history or the history of women's liberation. The second one here, Paul Meany, he's going to be talking about, he's going to be responding to the idea that you often hear that libertarianism is an old man's game. So Paul is the editor for intellectual history at libertarianism.org, which is a project of the Cato Institute. He's the host of the Portraits for Liberty, a podcast about uncovering and exploring underrated figures through history who have argued for a freer world, some of whom he's going to tell you about tonight. And his writing covers a broad range of topics, including proto-feminist writers, classical Greece, and Rome's influence on the American founding, ancient Chinese philosophy, tyrannicide, and the first argument for basic income. You can find him on Twitter as @PaulMeany2, although honestly, I think he tweets much more under the Portraits of Liberty Twitter hashtag. But I think Paul tonight is going to tell us a little bit about some of the women who have shaped libertarian thought.
Thank you so much. Okay, well, I started reading philosophy when I was about 17 years old, like a lot of people do. And I started off reading Plato and Aristotle, and I was so enthusiastic about it that I wanted to read more and more. So I started reading all these kind of introductory books, Introduction to the History of Philosophy, that kind of thing. And I read a bunch of them. And every time I read them, there was something that united them all. There was a similar theme, and it wasn't philosophy, but I couldn't put my finger on it for a few years. But as I read more and more philosophy, I realized the thing was, let's say you have a book with maybe 15 different philosophers you cover. If you're lucky, you might get 2 or 3 women. And so when I was younger, I thought this was just like, well, women were oppressed in the past, so it makes sense they weren't writing too much, and women in philosophy is kind of more of a modern thing. But I realized I was wrong about even that. There's been women all the way back to the 14th century, like Christine de Pizan. She was one of the first people in the Western world, at least, to argue women should be educated just like men. And she also argued that men and women have a moral equality between them. There's also people in ancient China in the 1st century BC who argued very similar things about women being educated like men. But as you go on, Christine de Pizan, she inspired all these different kinds of people. Arcangela Tarabati, Marie-George de la Gournay, all these proto-feminist writers most people have never heard of. But I just realized through this reading, I came to the conclusion that often women are very easily forgotten in history or completely written over entirely. And a lot of the time, the things that they achieve are claimed by men later on. And about a year later, when a year after I first started philosophy, I got into libertarianism. It was my first kind of foray into politics. And I thought that the big names in libertarianism, the people who really founded it the way it is today, were Milton Friedman, Friedrich Hayek, Ludwig von Mises, that kind of people. And I just took that as granted. But that isn't really the case. I'm going to try and explain why that's not really how libertarianism as a movement was founded. Maybe as an idea in some ways, but as a movement, it was founded by women. And so there's all these articles. If you look up libertarianism and women, you'll see Forbes has a very weirdly titled article, "Women don't like libertarianism because they don't like libertarianism." There's another one from the New Republic saying, "Why are libertarians mostly dudes?" And these two kind of points are connected. The first article from Forbes generally makes these kind of points. Women don't like libertarianism. They prefer security. They prefer government programs. I find that a little insulting, a little condescending, that apparently freedom isn't for everyone. But anyway, and the other one says, well, libertarians are mostly male. So you combine these two together, libertarianism doesn't appeal to women and libertarianism is mostly men. And so detractors can easily say, well, that means libertarianism must be an idea by white men for white men. And that's it. If you look back, a lot of the times, the great names, it'll be lists of white men. Normally, you don't really see too many women there. But that's a bit weird, because in reality, the first ever person to say the phrase, or to utter, or to coin the phrase libertarian movement was a woman, Rose Wilder Lane, in 1940. So I want to chat about 2 people. Normally, it's a trio. There's Ayn Rand, Rose Wilder Lane, and Isabel Patterson. But I'm sure you already know who Ayn Rand is. So I'm just going to talk about Isabel Patterson and Rose Wilder Lane, who are generally more obscure. So they had really, really similar lives. They almost had like parallel lives. Both were born in 1886. Rose Wilder Lane was born in South Dakota in De Smet, while Isabel Patterson lived up in an island in the middle of Lake Huron in Canada. But both of them moved around an awful lot as they were children. They both lived in the frontiers, and they didn't really have an awful lot of prosperity. Their families were quite poor and had to move around a lot, but they had quite a hardy upbringing. Another thing they had in common was that they both left home very early at the age of about 17 and 18, and they didn't have very many years of schooling behind them. Both of them only had about 2 years of traditional schooling each. For the most part, they were self-taught everything they knew, which I think is extremely impressive and amazing. But they both left their homes at young ages, and they went off to work low-wage jobs. Now, it might sound insulting to say low-wage jobs, but this is a time when women's rights were becoming more apparent and they had more opportunities. And they both got married quite young as well. But the interesting thing is they both didn't really love marriage all that much. They wanted to have their own lives. And both of their husbands weren't exactly very ambitious and didn't really want to do anywhere near as much as them. So they left them, simple as. They both didn't have children. So once they left their husbands, their lives kind of took off. Rose Wilder Lane became a very, very renowned reporter, went to Europe in the 1920s, had all sorts of columns. Isabel Patterson became a really influential literary critic in New York. And it's pretty big to be an influential literary critic in New York at the time, because this is when F. Scott Fitzgerald, Ernest Hemingway, and the Harlem Renaissance are all in full flux. So she was a tastemaker at a very, very important time. So they were both high up in their fields, but they didn't start off as libertarians. They started off kind of apolitical. They weren't too into political ideas, and actually they started off kind of as socialists. So Rose Wilder Lane, while she was living in Louisiana with her aunt as a teenager, she was introduced to socialist ideas and Eugene Debs. And eventually she actually voted for socialists and even flirted with the idea of joining the party. And by the time in the 1920s, when she was sent off to report in Europe, she was a pretty full-fledged communist until she went to the USSR, in what is now known as Georgia, where a farmer who lived in a village that had communal property for generations told her that centralization wouldn't work. And at first she thought he was just a bumpkin, didn't know what he was talking about. But the more she talked to him, the more she realized that a state-planned economy isn't the state commanding the economy, it's the state commanding people, because the economy is just people doing things. So she realized the larger the state is, the more you're going to have to tell people what to do on a daily basis. Isabel Patterson, on the other hand, she kind of began a little bit of politics. She was mostly a socialist. She voted for Eugene Debs as well. She voted for FDR, but because he was against prohibition. But prohibition was kind of the start of her tingling into politics. She was a teetotaler, but she just didn't really make any sense to her. Why ban alcohol? Why take away that freedom from people? But the real catalyst was the New Deal. And the New Deal was unprecedented in the size and scope it expanded the government to. And so with the New Deal in the background, communism on the rise in other countries, Isabel Patterson and Rose Wilder Lane were very afraid about the fate of liberal ideas. And they had a really good reason to be afraid. The early 20th century wasn't really a good time for liberal ideas or liberal principles at all. It was very much so in retreat. Extreme ideas like National Socialism and communism were a bit more seducing to a lot of intellectuals. And it kind of seemed that capitalism had failed, World War I had happened, the Great Depression. It seemed natural that the state ought to intervene in the economy. And by the 1940s, with the outbreak of World War II, with the American government commanding more of the economy than it ever had before, with war production, it kind of seemed like the future was just the state doing nearly everything. But so Rose Wilder Lane and Isabel Patterson were really, really afraid of this. They thought individualism was going to be wiped off the face of the earth. So they decided to both parallel, write in 1943, their magnum opuses. So I'll do them one at a time really fast. I won't go through everything, but I'll just give you the basic gist of what they talk about. So Rose Wilder Lane wrote The Discovery of Freedom. And a lot of historians before her would talk about the great battles, the great wars, the big navies, the great men of history. And she doesn't really have any time for any of that. She wants to talk about ordinary people and how they provided for themselves and their families throughout history, which is what we should really be focusing on, because that's what the majority of people are doing. They're not commanding big armies. And she started to realize that inside every person, there's kind of an energy. It's kind of, it sounds a little weird, a little hippie-ish, but bear with it. It's like an energy. And this energy allows you to be creative, thrift, it allows you to invent things, but only individuals can generate it, and only individuals can control it. She has this idea that each person is self-controlling and therefore responsible for your own acts. And because of that, every person is by their very nature free and has rights. And rights mean you can't do certain things to people without asking. And so she thought the only system possible to harness human energy was really for the state to back off. The state is kind of inert and dead. It can only take or protect things. Now, if it does, which one of us it does is an open question, but she believed the state didn't produce things. Individuals create wealth, not the government. No top-down plan. So she believed the best society we could live in is one where we have private property, very strong protection of our rights, and a very minimal state, so there's no creeping Leviathan. Isabel Patterson, really, really similarly, she wanted to look at why were some societies productive and other societies weren't. And some people might say, well, maybe it's because of, organizing a great military like the Roman Empire, or maybe it was because the one society was on a natural resource that was really important, like a certain kind of metal or something. There's some sort of determinism for it all, material factors, like people like Karl Marx would say. But Patterson believed ideas came first, and she believed that the societies that are most successful and most productive are the ones that best harness individuals' energy. And now it might sound like saying harness individuals' energy sounds like a state-commanded or state-run economy, but it's not. She has this very odd idea of society as a machine, but in her machine, individuals are what's called dynamos. They create energy. But on the other hand, the state is like a dead-end appliance. It doesn't have any energy production capacities whatsoever. All it can do is house the dynamos. And that's what her idea is. It's very much so a minimal government that doesn't really interfere too much in the lives of individuals and leaves them mostly free to pursue their own lives, to create, invent, start a company, do anything they want, write a book. You try it on your dime. That's the way it is. Anyway. But yeah, people like Patterson and Wilder Lane, they have a lot of the ideas that libertarianism is famous for today, like the idea of the state being a taker, not a maker. And you might not have heard of them, or a lot of people haven't really heard too much about them. You might understand Rose Wilder Lane because her mother, Laura Ingalls Wilder, but they had a massive impact at the time. A lot of people thought they were completely alone. Liberal principles were dead in the water almost. So a lot of people who were liberals kind of gave up. But Patterson and Lane, they wrote their books, and they weren't exactly massively popular amongst ordinary people, but for people who really cared about individualism and liberal ideas, these were like godsend. They're almost like a new Bible. And people kept writing to them, and they kept responding. And they kept up all this correspondence and started building a network and a movement, something that we could all do. But you might ask, well, how much do they actually have to do with movement? I haven't really heard too much about them. Well, Rose Wilder Lane is pretty much directly responsible for the first ever electoral college vote cast for a woman. Her protege, Roger McBride, was directly under her tutelage. She introduced him to libertarianism, and he was the one who cast the vote for Tony Nathan in 1972 as Vice President John Hospers. Isabel Patterson got a lot of praise from Ayn Rand, of all people, who did not praise very many people as her influences. She said that Isabel Patterson was the first ever person to explain how capitalism works in practice. And so other people at the time also recognized their importance. Another reporter called John Chamberlain, who used to hate Isabel Patterson, eventually admitted that if it had been left to us males, probably nothing much would have happened. Indeed, it was three women, Isabel Patterson, Rose Wilder Lane, and Ayn Rand, who, with scornful side glances at the male business community, had decided to rekindle a faith in America's older philosophy. There wasn't an economist among them, and none of them had a PhD, but they still did amazing things. Isabel Patterson's biographer, Stephen Cox, has very similar things to say. And this is something you can always pull out for people if they say libertarianism is for men or anything. He wrote that women were more important to the creation of the libertarian movement than they were to the creation of any political movement not strictly focused on women's rights. So I think that Lane and Patterson were extremely dedicated people that poured thankless years into creating a movement that we have today, that we've inherited. They spent loads of their time giving lectures, writing columns, responding to letters, all in the hope of rekindling individualism. And it might have seemed sometimes like it was pretty hopeless. But the work that they did all the way back then is why we can meet up today and talk about all these ideas, and it still exists. So next time someone says to you that libertarianism is astrology for men, or that libertarians are only men, pull out Rose Wilder Lane and Isabel Patterson, please.
Thank you, Paul. I do recommend you listen to both the Rose Wilder Lane and Isabel Patterson episodes of Portraits of Liberty, Paul's podcast. They're both really interesting. The Isabel Patterson one I in particular really enjoyed. And you'll get a whole lot more about specifically some of the work that she did around women's rights and things like that, which you might find interesting. And again, I'm sure there's going to be a lot of questions about that. Please do feel free to type your questions into the chat box. We'll be saving time for them at the end. But before we do, we have one more podcaster here for you today who shares other really interesting vignettes from history, other vignettes of history that you often do not hear. Kaytlin Bailey is a contrarian by nature and a provocateur by trade. Kaytlin is an internationally touring stand-up comic, sex worker rights advocate, and writer. She launched the Oldest Profession podcast in 2017 and has grown a fan base by telling better sex worker stories. In 2018, she returned to politics to challenge laws criminalizing the oldest profession as the director of communications for decriminalized sex work. In 2020, Bailey founded Old Pro Productions Incorporated, where she continues her stubborn crusade against whorephobia. You can find her on Twitter as @KaytlinBailey.
Thank you so much for having me, Kat and Elizabeth, Feminists for Liberty. And I'm thrilled to be a part of this conversation. Thank you so much to Jayme and Paul. Yeah, I am essentially a stand-up comic that got obsessed with sex worker stories and the sex worker stories that we've lost, that have been erased through history. I think both Paul and Jayme made excellent points about how we lose women's stories, and I have certainly come to think of whorephobia and the stigma against sex work as the pointy end of the spear of misogyny. I feel like if you look back at a lot of the justifications or like foundational assumptions that lead to things like coverture, that lead to things like women being unable to control their own economic assets, and really valuing and privileging economic liberty, comes from this idea that that women owning their own property is somehow sinful, that the freedom of movement and freedom of expression of women comes at the cost to their fidelity or their purity. And in a society, American culture is very much a product of Western culture, which is very much a product of patriarchy, paternal lineage, and paternal inheritance, which, just like from a basic biology perspective, is like banana pants, right? Because like there's never any question about like what the maternal line is, but we insisted on doing property through dudes, and in doing that became obsessed as a culture with the sexual fidelity and physical movement of women, and sex workers or whores, both like the archetypal whore and the lived experience of sex workers, who all existed throughout this entire period, often exercising quite a bit more economic liberty and agency than the culture they were living in would like them to, and paving the way for later generations. But was sorry, I lost my train of thought, but I'm confident that it was a really good point. I'm sorry, I should have had this talk more prepared, but basically I remember. So yeah, sex workers represent an existential threat to the idea of paternity, right? Because in an era before birth control and an era before paternity tests, oh, by the way, sex workers have been practicing birth control the whole time, right? It was only in the industrial age where we cut off communication between generations of women that were passing on this information. And as young single women move into the city, often working as domestics, right, where they are disempowered at work, they're not making enough money, they're to meet their basic survival needs. They're spending literally 24 hours a day in a house with men who often control their movements. They are ripe for a lot of sexual harassment and a lot of unintended pregnancies that literally ruin their lives. If women have give birth out of wedlock under this legal coverture, they have no cover. They live in a society that devalues their labor and calls them a whore. And I think that when we look back at the history of the United States, it's impossible to disentangle whorephobia from the history of feminism and women's liberty, and the history of liberty generally. Our first federal anti-prostitution law was also our first anti-immigration law, and it came from the state's desire to limit the freedom of movement of peoples. It came from the anti-Asian xenophobic racism that stated very explicitly that Chinese women were not to be allowed to enter the country for immoral purposes. And the way that they decided if you were immigrating for immoral purposes was if you weren't already married. That was the standard. If you weren't already married, you were assumed to be coming here for immoral purposes. Married people do prostitution all the time, so that did like literally nothing to solve the problem. But this later metastasizes and becomes the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1883, which smarter people than me have talked about all of the reasons why that was bad and dumb. This is followed by 1910, the first federal anti-prostitution law that applies to American citizens is called the Mann Act. It's also known as the White Slave Law, and it prevented, again, the freedom of movement, right? It became illegal as a woman you cannot transport a woman across state lines for immoral purposes. And this was sold to the American public as the only answer to the made-up crisis of white slavery, which is a thing that historians agree across the board was not happening, but was very much a fear of politicians and leaders at the time that scapegoated that scapegoated prostitution as society, as the worst possible social evil. And so in that way, sex workers become symbols. We become scapegoats, and we become a place that society goes to project their own shame. And so when we crack down on prostitution, we do nothing to alleviate the human suffering of exploitation, right? We do nothing to help any of the people that we saddle with arrest records, or starting originally in a very isolated case, the Civil War, but really in earnestness during World War I, rounding up women who we thought to be promiscuous or actively engaged in prostitution or making the wrong kind of eye contact with a cop, forcing them to undergo STD tests, registering them, locking them up, as Jayme explained, often institutionalizing women that were violating society's sexual mores. And we did it all in the name of protecting women by cracking down on prostitution. And it has never protected women. It has only limited our collective freedom of movement, because people that do not participate in the sex trade are still limited by these historical assumptions, and also by the literal laws. I mean, Sesta Fosta was signed into law in April 2018 by Trump. And I know lots of people that do not sell sexual services, right? That are sex educators, that work in harm reduction, that do, that produce erotic content that they do not consider sex work, that have been erased from the internet, right? MasterCard and Visa refusing to do work with Pornhub. I fear this kind of encroachment and this very old conversation about all of the things that the state needs to do to protect women from our own choices. And I think the criminalization of prostitution is, it's madness from an inch away, right? To lock people up, to lock consensual adults up for engaging in negotiated adult activities with each other. The fact that we've been doing it for so long shouldn't mask how crazy it's always been. And the fact that we see, the aggressive criminalization of prostitution happens in the 19th and starting in the early 1910s, right? It starts with the Page Act, 1875, the White Slave Law in 1910, and then by World War I, 1917, our involvement, we start to more aggressively criminalize prostitution. That's the year that all the brothels in San Francisco and a lot of other major cities are shut down. That's the year that we empower local police officers to round up women around military bases in the name of suppressing STIs. Spoiler, we didn't suppress any STIs. That's not what happened. Didn't do it. You can't. There are some problems you can't arrest your way out of. That's the message of the history of policing prostitution. And this is my favorite topic, and I know myself to be able to go on and on and on, but I think it's critical for conversations around liberty for us to look at these shadow spaces, right? These fringe places. Like look at pirates, look at sex workers, look at speakeasies, because we've been navigating questions of autonomy in Black market spaces. And I think it's impossible for women or queer people or people that do sex in a way that their high school guidance counselor wouldn't want them to be free in a society that arrests consensual adults for engaging in grown-up stuff. And I think that the history makes that very clear. Thank you.
Thank you, Kaytlin. That was very interesting. And I think the theme of all three of your talks so far has been that these are all sort of aspects of women's freedom, women's history that almost seem, it's probably not the right word for it, but counter-revolutionary in a way. Like, you don't hear them, right? Like, when you hear the mainstream discussion about women's history, you don't hear about, you know, how industrialization led to that. In fact, a lot of times from feminists, you hear that industrialization was terrible for women. A lot of times, you know, there are a lot of feminists who are against sex work because they think that anti-sex work laws protect women. You hear certainly that libertarianism is not for women, has never involved women, that women can't be libertarians. I'd like to hear from you guys. Why do you think that these narratives get sort of suppressed? Why don't you hear these ideas more often?
I can start. I think Paul hit on it when he talked about the way that women's stories get overlooked, because women's stories are often historically stories of the domestic and the intimate. They're often left out of these grand narratives that are kind of told in academic work and chronicles of war. And so I think the overlooking of economic activity, because it is that day to day, it, you know, it's something that we are all involved in, that we're so immersed in, it can almost be easy to overlook. I think this has led to it, you know, not so much getting written down in the history books, and then we wind up not discussing it at all. So Gerda Lerner and her colleagues who, you know, created the subfield of women's history, they started, I think, a wonderful trend towards seeking out those aspects of life that we don't discuss, so we can better understand how important they are to the bigger phenomena that we already know we're interested in.
I think that a big part of why women are often pushed to the side in philosophy and history, at least, is because if you're a female philosopher, all of a sudden it's women's philosophy, as if women were this small little minority of 10% of the population, not 50% of the earth. So if you're a woman and you write about a woman's issue, oh, well, put that in the women's category and the rest of the philosophy can stay in the philosophy section. I think that's the big problem a lot of the time, is that people don't take it seriously as proper philosophy because it talks about an important issue that actually has, you know, real world effects. So a lot of the authors I listed at the beginning, Christine de Pizan, Arcangela Tarbati, Marie Georges de la Grenée, I am pretty confident that most people haven't really heard anything about them whatsoever, but they're fabulous people that you would love to hear about. But I started to realize, as I read more and more, I realized a lot of things in history are very different than you thought it would be. I remember when I found out the first ever programmer, Ada Lovelace, was a woman in the 1800s. I was like, I couldn't even comprehend it. Or one of the first ever sci-fi writers was Margaret Cavendish in, I think it was the 17th century. But it just comes to show how little you actually know. You think you might know one thing one way, but then you realize it's entirely different. So I think it's a bit of a two-pronged approach of getting rid of all of your past preconceptions about things, and then stop saying that when women talk about their lives, it's a woman's issue. They're 50% of the population. That's
Can
me.
I just add real quick before Kaytlin answers too, that I feel like that, I'm glad you said that so much, Paul, because I feel like we still hear that a lot today too. Like people will be like, you know, in terms of like journalism, like why aren't there more women journalists covering hard politics, or why aren't there more like, you know, libertarian women writers, or just, you know, covering like these hard issues? And it's like, because when women are writing about issues that are hard politics still, and that are hard policy issues, but have a slightly like women-oriented bent, then they often get like labeled as like women's issues writers, even though it's like, why is like, I don't know, like abortion rights or something like any more of like not a hard politics issue than like tech policy or something. But like, it's, yeah, it ends up being very gendered the way we still talk about those things. So
even when it is tech policy, a lot of times it's a woman's take on tech policy. It's not just it's tech policy.
Like this special subspecies of people.
Right.
Right. Yeah. And it's, and I think a lot of that it goes back to, yeah, I'm biased, right? I see everything from a sex work lens. I think it's a philosophical key that opens many doors. This is my obsession, but I really do think that whorephobia has gone a long way in limiting the choices and the voices that we hear from women, limiting the stories that get written down, and then actively erasing those stories through periods of censure and often sex panics. We will go back and we've erased a lot of good ideas. One of the first women published in the Western world in 16th century Venice is Veronica Franco. She was an open courtesan, but her work is not celebrated in part because she talked openly about sex. We live in a culture, we live in a society that still associates the phrase public woman with prostitute, right? So meaning women that actively participated in the public sphere, like as actresses, or even as politicians, they're grappling with whorephobia, whether they've participated in the sex trade or not, to say nothing of the voices that we lose from people that participate in sex work and are then barred or pigeonholed, in that horrible echo chamber where people can only see and not hear you, which I think has been a lived reality for so many women in so many occupations of so many classes for so long.
I think continues today. I mean,
Yes.
if you look, you can't be a woman in the spotlight and not get those kinds of comments and not
Yep.
see like, there's a million reasons that I don't like Kamala Harris, but it's never the memes about her being on her knees or whatever, right? Like those are the things where I'm like, if you have an actual argument, this is the time to make the argument.
Right.
So far, our only question in the chat is, what is Kaytlin's wall hanging made of?
Yeah, it's this is wool. I think we bought it. This is we bought it on Etsy. I need to learn more about this because this is not the first time this has come up, and I need to be able to talk intelligently about my house. But I bought it because I like it, and it hangs here.
Does anyone out that is watching right now have any questions for any of our panelists or all of our panelists? If so, please. I don't know if people are able to unmute themselves or not.
Or they can just put it in the chat box.
Okay, you can just put it in the chat box if you have any questions. Could Jayme please give us the highlights of her interjurisdictional competition paper?
Yeah, sure, I can do that. I'll try not to give you more highlight than you want. The basic idea is that one of the things that the early United States did well is that it was a frontier in so many ways. So it was a physical geographic frontier, but it was also a space where there was a lot of innovation in political structure, and competition between different forms of governance was really active. And so the fact that the individual states were able to choose how they wanted to define and enforce property law within families, it created this almost competitive environment where the governors and legislators of different states were competing with each other to try to appeal to this new demographic, which was the independent woman. So we see this really explicitly along the Western frontier. They literally will be advertising to women who live, back east or in other parts of the country about how friendly their area is, how great the opportunity for jobs are. In the industrial Northeast, they advertise both directly to women and to the people who are actually running and creating factories. So they need to be able to get female workers. What's your incentive to work if you're not going to be able to keep what you earn, if you're going to have to give all of it up when you get married? And some of the memoirs of the women who worked in these factories, they talk about, maybe they are not single like most of the women, but maybe they've been abandoned. So they talk about like women jumping every time the door opens because maybe it's their husband who's abandoned them, who is technically still the owner of everything they have accumulated, and he can come back and take it. So that the idea is that the political competition that we got in the frontier environment of the democratic frontier United States really enabled it's not the only cause, but it enabled this really incredible acceleration in terms of the rights that women were afforded and the opportunities that were seen okay for them to pursue.
One of our questions from Twitter, Kaytlin, can you talk a little bit more about the connection between sex work criminalization and immigration restriction?
Yeah, absolutely. So as I said before, the first federal anti-prostitution law is also our first anti-immigration law, and that's the Page Act of 1875. And it was specifically, came about as part of a wave of anti-Asian, racist rhetoric during the period of 1860s, 1870s, 1880s. This is when a lot of Chinese immigrant workers were coming over to work on the railroad, and the tensions, things got bad, and legislators and moralists at the time were very explicit that one of the tactics that they were using was if they could get rid of Asian women, then they could maybe prevent Asian people from settling, from starting families, and from being able to own property and become established members of the community. And one of the major tactics of doing this was aggressively criminalizing prostitution and the sort of racist framing of like all Asian women as participants in the illicit sex trade. And so one example that I turn to all the time is the life story of Atoy. I think really plays this timeline out. She arrived in San Francisco 7 years before it was ratified as a city in the 1850s. She works openly as a sex worker. She's able to accumulate a lot of wealth. She kind of starts both Chinatown and also later the red light district, opens up a lot of brothels, but takes some clients that try to defraud her with fool's gold instead of real gold. And then also the Chinese Tongs at the time that were trying to get her to pay protection money using violence. She takes both of them to court, to a US court, right? So like a Chinese immigrant openly working as a sex worker went to the US court system to say, hey, you can't defraud me by giving me fake money, and you can't use violence to force me to give you a cut of my profits. And in many cases, she won. Now, as anti-Chinese sentiment essentially descends on San Francisco, a lot of vigilante, moralist, openly white supremacist groups target Chinese brothels specifically as part of the criminalization of sex work. So the criminalization of sex work and the criminalization of immigrant communities, specifically anti-Asian racism, I don't think can be easily separated from each other. We've been using the criminalization of victimless crimes as reasons to oppress all kinds of communities, right? The criminalization of marijuana is a well-documented example of this, as is the extra criminalization of crack cocaine. And I would argue that the criminalization of prostitution began as anti-Chinese sentiment and then sort of metastasized in a way to control all kinds of women after we stopped doing coverture.
Thank you.
So I have a question for all three of you, since this is Women's History Month, and we've certainly been focusing on the more historical aspects of all of this. But I think sometimes people have a tendency to think, okay, all of these things happened in the past. What about now? Can you put into context some of what you've been talking about in the modern context? How does this stuff still why does this still matter? Why bother talking about it? Are we just talking about stuff that happened a long time ago, or?
I sort of want to pass the mic immediately to Elizabeth Nolan Brown, has been doing some excellent coverage on exactly the way that these sort of racist tropes and our faulty assumptions in policing are playing themselves out in the way that we crack down on Asian-owned massage parlors in these raids and stings that are targeting, the immigrant community and doing absolutely nothing to eradicate exploitation or violence in the community.
I think history can have a really long residue that we can't really even see when we're living through it. So the establishment of the patriarchal family, and I know some people are probably going to bristle when they hear me using that word. I'm not even using it normatively, but just as a pure descriptor of a family where control is explicitly vested ahead of time in the male head of household, and we know that that's going to be who has the control. And this is something that human beings have been doing for millennia. It still is practiced. Most women living in the world, I think it's fair to say, still live under that kind of system. Most men still live under that kind of system. It's something that's baked deeply into kind of our DNA. And so when we talk about these kind of restrictions being legally enforced, even in the United States, which I think a lot of people would consider kind of the birthplace of the modern feminist movement, maybe, this is, I think it says a lot about the fact that almost every human living on the planet still has these kind of practices as part of their living memory. How can you completely expunge those and kind of interact with women in an equal space and be fully considering them and fully, evaluating them fairly? This is one of the issues that comes up most frequently in terms of discussions about the modern gender divide. Are we evaluating women fairly, or did we come up with our standards in a context where women weren't involved? And so now we don't really have kind of the right metrics, the right tools yet. So I think it still matters in that it's a part of all our lives, but it's also a history that we can really learn a lot from. And I think doing work like Kaytlin and Paul are doing is so awesome, because women have often been in this position. One of the kind of silver linings, I guess, of the opportunities that women were denied is that they got really good at organization. And I don't mean like a closet. I mean like organizing a religious community, organizing to accomplish a goal. And, women have made incredible contributions to community and society through history. So we can learn so much from what those women have done. And I salute you both uncovering that work. And hopefully, we're all flawed human beings. And hopefully we can continue to move forward and kind of be all listening and learning from each other, regardless of gender, and do our best to get past some of this baggage that we all carry.
I'd love to say something real quick. Just stop me if I'm taking too long, though. But I think a lot of people think that the history we own it. Like we look back and we take little bits from it. I think it's really the opposite. I think history owns us. A lot of our assumptions that we don't even know we hold come from somewhere in the past that you've no idea about, really. A lot of the time, I think a lot of people look back at history and they say, why are women oppressed everywhere, always? What was the reasoning? And you kind of have to start to understand why that existed. So it's going to be, I think it's very important to understand. It's very good going into the future. But I think there's a really good series called The Other Voice. The Other Voice, they just have philosophical works by women that you wouldn't normally know about. That's why it's called The Other Voice. And the series has a really good introduction essay. And it kind of goes through what the four main sources of misogyny in the Western world are. And I'll just go through them really, really fast as best I can. The first one is the ancient Greeks. People like Aristotle and Galen, using their science, they thought that women were completely inferior beings, didn't have the right kind of bodies, their humors weren't balanced. The word hysteria comes from the Greek word for womb, because that was where all the bad energy was produced, apparently. Then you go on to the Romans. That's when patriarchy becomes patriarchy. The paterfamilias had power over life and death of everyone in his household. Then you move on next to the Bible. And the Bible is much more ambiguous. I wouldn't say the Bible is like, it's very hard to parse out what it says overall. St. Paul says lots of great things about women, but says lots of bad things too. So it's more of a murky tradition that people took from selectively. And so it was really open for authors to selectively use quotes to their own benefit. And the other part is the church fathers. And the church fathers, some of them had very good opinions of women, but a lot of them had very poor opinions of women. And these four sources became fundamental to the intellectual life of the Western world. And there was a massive hangover of it. And so a lot of the women's philosophy that I talk about, it isn't often covered, was debunking all of that. And all that comes before modern feminism. A lot of people think that feminism begins maybe with Mary Wollstonecraft, maybe it begins with Seneca Falls, maybe it begins with the suffrage movement. I think it goes back much further in the Western world, at least. I think it begins when Christine de Pizan, the first ever woman to write professionally and earn a living from it, takes up her pen to defend her sex. And I think that it's very important to understand where we came from, or you'll never understand where you're going to go next. So that's my take on all history.
Thank you. So we're going to ask one last question, which is just sort of, and maybe you guys kind of just did this, but this is just, if there's one or two things, quick things you can want people to take away from today, either in terms of messaging or in terms of things that they should check out to get a further view on some of the things you were talking about. You guys could each give those, please. Jayme, you want to start again?
Sure. I'll stick to that one sentence. I'll say economic freedom is not tangential. It's primary to women's advancement. That's true of the past, and that's true of the future. And if it's not too self-serving, I'll encourage everybody to access some of the resources that are available on the Hayek Program's website for learning about economic activity and the role that economic activity plays in human society and in our lives.
Yeah, also, when you guys say this, could you also tell people where they can find more of you, if that's a website or on Twitter or whatever?
Oh yeah, I have a website. I put all my research up on my website. So that's kind of like the library repository. And then I occasionally write for EconLib. So I tweet to let people know when something new is up there, or if I have a new article out or anything else like that.
Thank you. Kaytlin?
Yeah, absolutely. You can listen to me almost every week at the Oldest Profession podcast. We have every episode an annotated bibliography and a lot of extra great content at the oldestprofessionpodcast.com. We do an annual event called the Old Pro Project, which you can learn more about at oldproproject.com. And you can follow everything that we're doing at Old Pros at Old Pro Inc. on Instagram and Twitter. And if you want more from just me, I'm at Kaytlin Bailey, spelled weird, also on social media.
And what's your one takeaway?
Oh yeah, that yes. I had this prepared, but then I forgot. I think it all comes back to listening to sex workers, and I think listening, not stopping the arrests, I think is the most important thing. But I think it's so important for feminists, for libertarians, for people that think about big picture policy, to look at the history of criminalizing prostitution and the unintended consequences, because there's only so many times you can do the same thing over and over again and call it a mistake.
Thank you. Paul?
I would say that whenever you're reading anything about history, just understand that history is too complicated for any one person to understand. There's billions of people on the planet. You can't know how their lives went out. All you can do is have a few loose facts and a narrative to set it in place. But that means you always have to be questioning the narrative, whatever people are telling you. If people tell you women don't do philosophy, you got to question it and see what actually was happening. It's very hard to navigate and find out what really happened in history, but that's why it's worth it. But if you enjoy what I talked about, I have a podcast, Portraits of Liberty. I write for Libertarianism.org all the time because it's my job. I cover a lot of topics. I do a lot of different stuff. I recently just did one on the intersection of Buddhism and Libertarianism. About to release one on the first ever person to coin the phrase human rights in the 1500s. I've done stuff on the medieval ages, ancient China, trying to expand further and further out and be as diverse and different as possible. So thanks a lot.
Yes, thank all three of you for sharing just a little spotlight of some of the great work that you do, Jayme, Kaytlin, Paul. And thank all of y'all who tuned in today live. If you came in the middle of this, will all be up on the Feminists for Liberty YouTube channel later this week. And that's a good time to plug. Please follow us on social media. We're on Facebook and Instagram as Feminists for Liberty and YouTube. And we are on Twitter as @FeministLiberty. You can also find our website at feministsforliberty.com. That has some of the various events and media and things like that we've been doing. And please follow #F4L chats for future panel discussions like this. We try to do them at least once a month. We're putting together a pretty interesting one for April as well. And if you enjoyed this discussion here tonight, and you've enjoyed some of the other work that we've been doing, shining a light on libertarian feminism ideas and work, and trying to build a more a more free world for everyone, please do donate. We are funded entirely by individual donations from people like you. You can do that on our website, feministsforliberty.com.
Also, we have a swag shop where you can get cool shirts that say things like libertarianism is consent culture and other fun slogans. It is society6.com/feministsforliberty. So you guys should check that out too.
Or that cool poster behind Liz.
Yes, or this cool poster, which you can kind of see. So thank you everyone for joining us tonight.